Hello, everyone. Once again, this is Madeline Chassel, SBI Policy Director, and we're about to start our call on the global secular movement. It's our monthly call, and we're glad that you've joined us today. If at any point you need to speak up, you all should be on mute at the moment. Again, if you're online, you can press your microphone button to the left of your name, or you can press *6 if you've joined us on the telephone only. And there's also a chat window that you can reach me at if you are joining us on the web. I want to highlight quickly for you this month's International Hotspot. This is one of our sign-on letters, and all of them can be read online on our website. There's a link here for you. This one went out to on the cause of Iran and Pakistan. You can see that it is addressed to several of our leaders and also abroad. And if you would like to read the letter, it's right there in the agenda for you. Hopefully it will be highlighted later by one of our SBI staff. But moving right along, I want to see which of our project and member spotlight special guests are here today. So I'm wondering if we have Veronique here. Veronique, are you here? And forgive my bumbling of your name. If you are, just press *6 to unmute yourself.
Hi there, can you hear me? This is Veronique Pluviose.
Hello, yes, I can. Thank you for introducing yourself, and please tell us about the Do Not Harm Act.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you about a bill that was introduced on May 18th with Congressman Kennedy, Joe Kennedy of Massachusetts, and Congressman Bobby Scott of Virginia. And together they introduced the Do No Harm Act. The Do No Harm Act is basically a bill that seeks to correct some of the overreach that we have seen with a law that was passed in 1993 called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. When Congress passed the law in 1993, it was intended to restore the protection for religious minority groups in response to a Supreme Court case regarding the use of peyote by some American Indian employees who were fired upon learning, and their benefits were taken away upon learning that they participate in a peyote religious use. The Supreme Court essentially reasoned that because the law was a law of general application, therefore they didn't really give full weight to the significance for those participant members with regard to their religious rights. So Congress then passed a law called RFRA, short RFRA, that basically says, hey, if the government's going to take an action, it has to meet a compelling government interest, but it also must be the least restrictive means to do so. So there is a compelling government interest in reducing the use of drugs. However, the question for RFRA was this would not have been the least restrictive means. In other words, there weren't any special accommodations or understanding to contextualize why the peyote was being used by the employees. By the way, not on their work time, but afterward. And so RFRA came into law with the support of broad left and right coalition, and it was intended to essentially respect and provide protection for religious minorities. However, since the passage of the federal RFRA, we have seen 21 states pass versions of RFRA, and unfortunately, in many instances, it's been used as what Congressman calls as a sword and not a shield to advance the rights of others, but rather as a sword to cut down the rights of others. And I think most recently in the news, we've seen attempts for people to use these so-called sincerely held religious beliefs or religious freedom or religious liberty or faith-based reasons to deny people basic public accommodation rights, such as going to restaurants or having a baker bake a cake for you. And we've seen it more predominantly used to discriminate against LGBT members. And Mr. Scott, of course, being a stalwart of the civil rights generally, understood all too well that these were shades of some of the darkest Jim Crow errors that we have seen in this country's past and history. And so he has been working on addressing some of the overreach of RFRA and came together, particularly after the Hobby Lobby case. Many of your callers may be aware that this was a case where the Supreme Court in 2013 decided that an employer, a limited liability corporation, can claim to have a religious view that would allow them to deny women the right for contraceptive coverage in their health care plan. Justice Ginsburg warned that this kind of reasoning would open up Pandora's box and would be extremely problematic, because now somebody's religious viewpoint and employers can essentially cause harm to a third party. And in the case of Hobby Lobby, it would be the women employees who have purchased health care plans. So the Do No Harm Care Act was introduced by Congressman Kennedy and Mr. Scott to essentially restore RFRA's original intent, that is to protect religious freedom without inflicting harm on others. So what the law would say is it basically would prevent RFRA from being used as a claim to deny people from protection against discrimination laws or laws promoting equal opportunity, such as the Civil Rights Act. It would also prevent RFRA from being used to deny workers protection, such as equal pay, protection against child abuse, protect access to health care information and referrals and provisions, and also say that if you're receiving a benefit from the government through a service contract or cooperative agreement, the people who are doing so have to essentially abide by the federal laws that protect the beneficiaries of the program, and must follow the federal laws that are tied to it. And that's essentially what the purpose of the law would attempt to do, so that you can't have it that people are basically allowed to use, stand on their sincerely held religious belief to undercut the legal protections of other persons.
Veronique, thank you. I want to introduce our CEO, Edwina Rogers, and see if she has any specific questions to facilitate more discussion on this topic. Edwina, are you there? Edwina, are you there?
Maybe the *6 button?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are. There you are.
Okay,
Hello.
Yeah. I was on mute. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Veronique. Thanks so much for that, for all of that background. It was very, very helpful. Just so that you know, our coalition, we've been putting together letters, sign-on letters, just, kind of state by state, as we have seen this unfold all the way from Arizona, to North Carolina and Mississippi and Tennessee, and to keep going, and the situation gets worse and worse. I was wondering, so the new issue about the bathrooms and then the public restrooms that's going on, that started in North Carolina, that's now spread to Mississippi, and no telling where else that might go. As far as the legal arguments that are going on there out of those states, and now, of course, the Justice Department is involved, has this RFRA issue been cited over there, or is it not one of the issues that are keeping up on that side?
So what this bill would be is a federal, if you will, model, perhaps for some of these states to adopt. And one of the things I neglected to mention in my summary is that federal RFRA does not apply to the states, and that's because in the 1990s, the Supreme Court invalidated the federal RFRA law as it relates to the states. And that's why you've seen states individually introducing their own RFRA law, if you will, that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or some version of it. So that's one. This particular bill, if adopted, would not stop what's happening at the state level. That being said, it's also important to distinguish that in some states, they are using some kind of sincerely held belief as a reason for why they are discriminating. For example, trying to limit the use of transgender persons from using restrooms or certain designated restrooms. In the state of Mississippi, yes. In the state of North Carolina, however, it was not based on a sincerely held standard. So it's very important as we're looking at the landscape across the nation in terms of what's happening from state to state, if people are addressing it, that they look at the particular state statutes closely to see what is the basis for which the states are asserting the right to raise a claim, if you will.
Okay, and then, but it would, if it's successful and passes, it might help us at the federal level with the health insurance and women having access to contraception through their employer.
If I may, let me give you some examples of where we think this is such a law would be helpful. It would definitely let people know they can't raise a sincerely held religious belief as a reason for why an employer or a university would deny their student or their employees, their female employees and female students, insurance plans that also covers contraceptive coverage, or in some instances, it could cover hormone therapy, if you will, for those who are undergoing gender sex change operation. Another area where we are seeing this is that, for example, in a case that came up in Utah, they challenged, the Department of Labor was investigating child labor violations, allegations of child labor laws. And in this case arose in Utah. The Department of Labor went in and attempted to interview the witness, to depose the witness. The witness raised success. The witness was allowed to, under RFRA, not to testify and give testimony to the Department of Labor about labor practices that violated child labor laws, federal child labor laws. And so in that case, then the Department of Labor had to then go to a third, the contracted company, to essentially get at the record that they were attempting to get from that particular house of worship that was found to have, in fact, violated child labor laws. And there are also instances where we saw in the Second Circuit where RFRA was allowed to be used as an available defense in an age discrimination suit when a member of a house of worship sued after being forced to retire when they had turned 30. And what we wanted to make clear was you have the law, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, that clearly would have forbade this, but in fact that person was allowed to use RFRA as a defense. And so there are many instances where we are seeing this. We also saw it most recently with U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and National Association of Evangelicals, and three other organizations argued that they had a right to a government funding. They received funding to run a program, and what they did is they said this was to assist with these unaccompanied minors that were coming through the southern border because of some of the atrocities that these young folks and their families are experiencing in places like Honduras and Guatemala. And these particular religious entities, organizations that had contracts to provide services to these unaccompanied minors, then tried to use RFRA to deny certain health services to some of the minors because those health services violated their sincerely held religious belief. And so these are very real cases that are happening. They're not necessarily getting the attention in the media, and we find that problematic. We also find it problematic that there are languages right now that permits some of these same entities that are that have grants and are carrying out important and invaluable social service programs, but for some reason they have been allowed to get around the non-discrimination statutory provisions, and they can discriminate in their hiring, which essentially harkens back to the date of no or Jews or Muslims need apply. And for Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Scott, we think that that's just taxpayer-funded discrimination should just not be permitted. And RFRA, this is an overreach of RFRA, which is why they introduced the Do No Harm Act.
So it looks like all kinds of federal laws are just being trumped and trampled on. Thank you for those examples. That really helps clear it up. So more on the side of how you're going to get this through Congress, which committees has it been referred to? And have you been able to collect any co-sponsors? And is there a plan over on the Senate side? And is the executive branch going to come out and speak and support this legislation? Is there any plan for maybe, are the Republicans talking about having a fix, or do they not see that there is a problem? So those are all kind of more logistic type questions that I'm sure that you guys have thought about and have some strategy on those.
Sure, and I'm going to try to answer as many of those questions, and if I forget anything, please remind me. So the committee, the committee that has this bill is the Judiciary Committee, House Judiciary Committee, and it would be helpful if your committee, if your contingency reached out to Congressman Nadler, who I know has spoken to your organization before, and also Congressman Steve Cohen, who is the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Constitution. And those two particular members, it would be great to hear from them. Obviously, Congressman Conyers, as the ranking member on the House Judiciary Committee, it would be great to get him on board. We have received additional co-sponsors, although, you know, this bill was dropped on the week right before the members left. So we have Congresswoman Slaughter of New York, Congressman Pocan of Wisconsin, Sean Maloney of New York, Congressman McGovern of Massachusetts, Congresswoman Holmes Norton of Washington, D.C., and Congressman Cicilline of Rhode Island. We are gathering names and collecting names of additional members, and so when the members get back in June, we should be dropping additional new names of co-sponsorships. We've received support from the Equality Caucus here on the House side, the Congressional Working Women's Groups, also as well as some members of the Congressional Black Caucus and others who are planning on joining as co-sponsors of this legislation. With regard to a Senate introduction, it is most likely that Senator Blumenthal, whom we had been working with on this bill for about a year, is Senator Blumenthal of Connecticut is the person that will likely introduce this bill, but it would certainly be helpful if your members were to reach out to his office and others who are also concerned about some of the overreach of this bill. I do understand that some of the concerns that our members on the Hill have is not coming across as this bill being anti-religious, but rather we are underscoring that, in fact, the purpose of this bill is to really be more true to the spirit and the language of the First Amendment, which is not so much about being pro-one religion or anti-religion, but recognizing that one's religious viewpoints should not trump the the laws that protect fellow Americans, and that's something that Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Scott want to underscore. And the last point I think you raised was whether or not there are interest in some of the Republicans. So by and large, I think it's fair to say that people are squirmish about this issue because they're concerned about being called anti-religious. But what we have seen in Congress in the last 2 weeks before we left out, as we introduced this bill, is that there were languages that was introduced to House appropriation bills that essentially would expand the right of faith-based institutions, religious groups, who are either contractors, have cooperative agreements, or are doing any form of procurement with the federal government to essentially raise their religious, sincerely held religious-based views as a way to essentially not necessarily comply with employment discrimination laws. And that was recently added to the defense spending bill, what we call here MILCON appropriations bill. It was added to the energy and water appropriations bill, of all things. And it was recently attached to an authorization bill regarding the National Defense Authorization Act. And this all happened literally in the last 2 weeks of May, as the members were leaving. And during that debate, there was some scuttle on the floor because it was clear that their direct intended target was to essentially cut out the protection that President Obama had provided for against LGBTQ discrimination in the executive order. And so the language that was added was essentially a way to undercut the president's executive order protection of LGBTQ by contractors who would discriminate. And that is where we are right now. There was a lot of a scuttle on the floor, verbal scuttles, and so that's where we stand right now. I hope I've answered all your questions.
Oh yes, no, we saw all that. So the trend is going the wrong direction, and bill by bill, unfortunately.
If I can just jump in, on June 25th, it will be the 75th anniversary of when President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, and that was the very first time by law, by executive order and by law, it prohibited employment discrimination against workers in the defense industry who were being discriminated on the basis of race, religion, color, or national origin. And so to see that 75 years later, we're now seeing attempts to really overturn that important executive order, we think it's especially problematic.
So if these pass, then these contractors, government contractors in the defense arena and energy, I wonder if they could go back and discriminate on race or gender or religion, or is it only gay, lesbian, transgender that's left out there not protected?
It would be the universe, because if you have a sincerely held belief, Mr. Scott always gives the example that, members of the KKK also see themselves as Christian, and they have a sincerely held belief that members of the races should not mix. Then you're going to be hard-pressed to find someone who has a sincerely held belief that racial mixing should not occur as to why it is then that person shouldn't have a legitimate protection keeping them from engaging in employment discrimination practices for issues that we thought we had settled 51 years ago when President LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act.
Wow. Okay, well that definitely gives us something to think about. And what about it sounds like there's plenty of support coming from the Obama administration.
Yes and no. Yes, there is. We should also be wary of the fact that there is an OLC, a 2007 Office of Legal Counsel memo that actually permits RFRA to override statutory non-discrimination provision, and that is still in effect, and the Obama administration is aware of that, and there have been repeated calls by over 90 groups asking the Obama administration to repeal that reading of RFRA, and unfortunately that hasn't happened.
Yes, we have signed on to that letter and that appeal. Now, that happened in the tail end of the Bush administration, correct?
That's correct, but when the Violence Against Women's Act was reauthorized in 2013, the Obama administration did, in fact, affirm that the OLC memo is still a good interpretation of the law, and therefore it's still, RFRA is still allowed to trump the non-discrimination provision in the Violence Against Women's Act, which was the first time we expressly, Congress expressly put in a protection to protect LBGT.
Hi. Yes. Well, so I have been taking up all your time. Can we open it up and see if anyone else on the line has any questions? I know we've had a thorough conversation, but I'm sure that I've missed something here. So Madeline, you want to see if anyone else wants to get in
Absolutely.
here?
My next thought. Yes, I would love to open up the floor. So let's give a minute here to see if anyone has any questions for Veronique. And remember to press *6 to unmute yourself, or you can reach me in the chat window with any questions. All right, we'll have another opportunity to address all of our speakers at the end of the call. Veronique, thank you so much for your time, and Edwina for your thorough questions. I'd like to.
I know Veronique has to scoot, so that's why we wanted to get her on so she can get on and get off and go and speak to other coalition groups. So thank you very much. I have to admit I'm a little more depressed than I was after having all this additional.
Not my intention.
It's worse than I thought, but we'll have to start going office to office. I'll even try with Goodlots people, which I know very well. And I am a Republican, and I know most of the work has to be done on that side. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good conference.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
So I'm going to flip the coin to the other end of our religious freedom discussion, and we're going to have a speaker on the international religious freedom issue. Dwight Bashir, are you here with us today?
So, Madeline, I got an email, and he's going to have to join us next month in July. So, and I know Jason Frye is chomping at the bit with quite a lot. He's got about 11 issues that SCI and the coalition is going to be addressing over the next month or so that he wanted to run down for us. So, we'll plan on hearing about this new report, the annual report that is coming from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for our July call, which is just as well because it was actually too much for one call.
Okay, good. Okay. And Jason is here with us today?
Yes.
Okay, Jason. So Jason Frye, our trusty spearheader on all sign-on letter issues. We'd love a debriefing right now. So Jason, if you're there, please speak up. Jason. Remember to press *6 or the microphone button next to your name. I know you're there. Here, Jason, I'm going to try to help you out here. I'm going to send you an unmute request. And that should help you to unmute yourself. So while we figure that out, I'm going to give a quick update from our Fellows Corner. And we do have a new fellow with us recently. Peter Carl Jonson is our newest fellow. And Jonson, or Jonasson, maybe Ms. Rogers will correct me, is a faculty member at Western Sydney University in the Greater Metropolitan Area of Sydney. He's a special personality psychologist who uses evolutionary, primatological, and behavioral economic models to conduct research on sex differences, the dark side of human nature, sexual and romantic relationships, and sexuality. So he'll be joining our Marty Klein group of philosophers and psychologists. So please read more about his background on the website. There's a link in the agenda as well. Elizabeth Loftus, who's been with us for quite some time, is a professor of law, psychology, and social behavior at UC Irvine. She is going to receive the 2016 Isaac Asimov Science Award for the American Humanist Association. And if you've read at all about Elizabeth Loftus, she's always talking about the mind and the brain, and especially false memories. Her work is seen throughout the media, so we follow her career extensively, and she is fascinating to read about. In the study of increased affluence explains the emergence of aesthetic wisdoms and moralizing religions. Ian Morris, another one of our fellows, and 3 other researchers explored the correlation between the rise of moralizing religions with economic development and political complexities. So how those relate, both the rise of religion and the development of our economies. And he's done lots of studies on that. Very interesting to read as well. Michael Semple, who you'll see in the media a lot, wrote an opinion piece recently about the challenges facing the newly appointed Afghan Taliban leader. And I won't butcher that name, but you can read it in the agenda. And you can always read more about our fellows and their happenings in our daily news clips. There's also a link available right here in the agenda, and I'll show you where that is on our website, where you can sign up for both newsletters, both our weekly newsletter, which is all original articles, the weekly SPI newsletter, or the Daily Digest, which is our secular news bites on science, politics, religion, and our fellows. So hopefully that will excite you for future, and I would like to see again if Jason is able to join us. Jason,
Hi,
hi, there
I'm
you
back.
are. Wonderful. Good. So forgive my interlude, and please tell us more fundamental things about what goes on at Secular Policy Institute.
All right. So there are 2 advocacy letters that are mentioned on the agenda that I think are incredibly important. Firstly, the governor of Georgia a couple months ago vetoed a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And there was a similar situation like that where Bobby Jindal, the former governor of Louisiana, he couldn't get a RFRA passed, so he had an executive order implementing it as far as he could. Well, John Bell Edwards, his successor, who's now the governor of Louisiana, he decided to remove that and push LGBT non-discrimination a lot further. So one letter that we put out was to thank Governor Edwards for doing that, for leading in the cause of fairness and reason, and I think that's incredibly important, especially because the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was brought up earlier, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I think it's important to show support for politicians who step up to the plate for the cause of fairness, reason, and having a good neutrality towards the separation of church and state the way it should be. On top of that, there is a letter that was put out about Tennessee, and Tennessee has a particular piece of legislation that allows for counselors and other mental health professionals to decline to serve clients if it conflicts with their sincerely held religious belief or deeply held moral conviction. And this is part of what I call the second wave RFRAs. The first wave RFRA, of course, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, came from the 1993 Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act that said that your personal religious exercise could not be substantially burdened without a compelling state interest, yada, yada, yada. And then in 1997, as was mentioned earlier, the Supreme Court came out saying that the federal RFRA didn't apply to the states, it only applied to Congress and the federal government, and from there, 20 states over the course of nearly 20 years put out a Religious Freedom Restoration Act mirroring the federal one. Well, after the Hobby Lobby decision, after the marriage equality victories of Windsor and Obergefell, what happened was different states started putting out highly bills that had a high degree of animus towards LGBT people, Mississippi being the most prominent example. We put out one of those letters as well. Well, these particular types of legislations put doing your job against fairness. This particular one essentially says that if you're a mental health professional and you have deeply held moral convictions against war, you could decline to serve someone who was a soldier. Or if you had deeply held religious convictions or moral convictions against non-married couples living together, you could refuse to serve them. And these are if you have, if you provide a referral. But in Tennessee, one of the problems is that a quarter of the 6.2 million Tennesseans live in rural areas. So this is, you know, just it's brilliant in its tactic, because it puts the core American values of fairness and liberty and religious freedom. They put them all against each other. And I suggest that you guys read it and certainly sign it, and then promote it so other groups can sign it as well. It's important to consider the fact that though it strikes a chord at the freedom to not be forced to do something, the freedom from coercion, that it goes towards mental health professionals who, you know, they sign, they have to abide by particular ethical guidelines that the general public doesn't have to. And so I don't know. There's a lot that goes into this, and I suggest that you look at that. Beyond that, there are several advocacy projects that I'm working on right now that I thought I'd bring up today, that letters are in the process of being written on. The first is the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. This one came about a couple years ago because there was a Russian whistleblower who was tortured and killed, and the particular law mainly applied to dealing with Russia, and it deals with granting the president the ability to provide sanctions such as removing a visa, barring entry to someone, preventing a visa to be issued, barring entry to someone who has a visa in the United States, and also freezing assets of somebody who was either complicit or directly involved in violating someone's civil and human rights. It's more specific because prior to that, when hold on one second. Prior to that, when sanctions would occur, they would be placed against an entire country, and it's essentially when sanctions are placed upon an entire country, usually it's the poor people who suffer. It's like taking a sledgehammer where a scalpel is necessary. This particular law, which is lauded by Freedom House, it passed in the Senate. It's waiting to go through the House of Representatives, but it's there to go after the people who directly benefit from the violation of human rights. And a letter will be produced about that very soon. On top of that, our delightful guest speaker brought up a particular memo, the OLC memo from 2007. In 2007, the George W. Bush Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel put out a memo about a Christian charity group called World Vision, and it essentially said that certain groups based upon religious commitments could be exempt from following employment non-discrimination standards set forth by the federal government. And a couple of years ago, or I think it was last year actually, over 130 groups, some of which signed the original RFRA, and a lot of secular groups, such as our own, signed this particular letter to ask the president to rescind that 2007 memo. Well, something changed that kind of goes towards our benefit in pushing the case of rescinding that memo, which subsequently didn't happen. A group of legal scholars, I believe 12 legal scholars at the University of Columbia's law school, came out with a paper advocating the rescinding of that particular OLC memo from 2007. And I am putting out a letter on that very soon. Beyond this, there was another situation that happened in Nebraska. There was an inmate in the Nebraska State Penitentiary named Stephen Cavanaugh. Stephen Cavanaugh is a Pastafarian, and if you're an inmate in the Nebraska Department of Corrections and you are of a particular and recognized religious affiliation, you get certain benefits. You get visits by clergy members of your particular faith affiliation. You get the right to receive literature. You get the right to wear clothing and pendants. You get the right for time off for worship services, etc., etc. And Stephen Cavanaugh, who's a Pastafarian, he was denied this by the prison officials. He took them to court, and in district court a couple months ago, the judge ruled that Pastafarianism was satire and not religion. This has some profound implications. It's kind of interesting that the weight of a lot of cases say that the government can't decide what's a sincere religious belief, but this goes and it determines that, and it should be it has a chilling effect for the government to say what is religion and what is not religion, and it allows for the government to employ a test of favoritism towards which religions they like and which they don't. And so a letter will be coming out about that as well. And with this particular, with our wonderful guest speaker earlier, the particular bill that's going through the House right now, that's at the Judiciary Committee, it's H.R. 5272. It's called the Do No Harm Act. And yes, it's only about the federal RFRA, not about the state's RFRAs. And the implications there are, when we're talking about the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, that certain groups like the Little Sisters of Mercy, Hobby Lobby, etc., they try to, and some of them have been successful at getting exemptions from mandates because of the federal RFRA, not the state RFRAs. Though the states have their own jurisdictions and their own RFRAs, I think that this is going to be a fantastic thing should it go through. But like has been said, it's in committee and there is not a sponsor in the Senate yet. And I'm putting together a letter on the Do No Harm Act. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's about time that it's finally here. Then, speaking of the House of Representatives, Mark Pocan, who is a representative from Wisconsin, sponsored Dan Barker, who is the co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, to offer a secular invocation at the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives allows guest invocators to come in should they be ordained by a recognized body in the faith which they practice. They have to be sponsored by a member of the House, and they must deliver an invocation that is directed towards a higher power. And that's really broad and really wide open. But Dan Barker says that he has been ordained as a minister. He was ordained as a minister a long time ago, but according to the chaplain who denied the petition, the chaplain of the House, who denied the petition, he's not practicing the religion in which he was ordained. This is very disheartening. I'm putting together a letter on this right now as well. And beyond what's happening in the United States, there's several other areas of concern that I'm just going to highlight quickly, and you'll be seeing letters about them coming out in the next couple weeks. In 2011, the Colombian High Court, the Colombian Constitutional Court, it came out and it told the Colombian Congress that it had 2 years to provide marriage recognition for the Republic of Colombia. And the Congress failed to do so. And over the last couple of years, the court debated, and it just came out with its verdict. And now Colombia has marriage equality. So I'm going to be writing a letter based on that. So now in South America, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Uruguay have marriage equality. There will be a letter penned on that very soon. There's another situation that's happening in Switzerland and Bulgaria, and there's lots of things that are happening in the different cantons in Switzerland. It's not nationwide, but it's centered in the cantons. So over the last couple of years, different things have happened. One canton banned the construction of mosques, and another canton issued a ban on wearing the burqa in public that would result in a 6,500 British pound fine. Another canton, there's a cultural practice where the teacher in a primary and high school environment will shake the hands with the students before and after the school day, and 2 Syrian boys who were at one of the schools said that it conflicted with their religious practice. So to accommodate this and to stop any conflict, the school district prohibited the shaking of hands, which outraged the parents and outraged the canton. A canton is like a state in Switzerland, by the way. And with this, the canton passed a law mandating handshaking. And there's a lot that's happening right there that it's rather concerning from a human rights standpoint. But in Bulgaria, the second largest city in Bulgaria, the municipal district had a burqa ban on their particular legislative agenda, and they voted that down. This is a complicated issue. It's a complicated issue owing to women's rights, owing to the right to wear what you want, owing to also resentment and animus towards refugees and migrants. This is a complicated issue. There's lots of places that have bans on sartorial religious expression, headscarves, niqab, shawls, burqas. Turkey has had prohibitions on headscarves in government buildings in the past. I don't know if they have it at the moment because the current president has led more towards having a greater expression of religion in the public sphere, but it's not just been Western, mostly Christian or secular European countries. On top of that, the European Court of Human Rights has upheld religious headscarf bans as not violating the European Human Rights Charter. So there's a lot that's happening with this, and I'm working on this one. It's going to take me a little time to put this one together because um, it's a minefield because there are a lot of conflicting things. Like I said, there's women's rights, there's human rights towards religious expression, and there's also a fair amount of resentment towards refugees and immigrants. It's a melting pot of a mess, and a letter will be coming out, or maybe 2 or 3 letters will be coming out on that. Um, One letter that I'm nearly done with, and this is incredibly important to talk about. Um, in Pakistan, there are certain cultural practices that women oftentimes have a far more difficult time in life because certain ideas about the worth of women and the place of women in society. Granted that Pakistan has had a female prime minister, and there are quotas for the number of women that have to be in the National Assembly, but in Pakistan, the protection for domestic violence against women is it's embarrassingly lacking. So the province of Punjab recently enacted a particular law against that actually mandates the province of Punjab to set up crisis centers, to have crisis officers to help women who have been domestically abused. It sets a new law that prevents women from being fired or kicked out of the home after they've been domestically abused or otherwise abused, and also to set up a toll-free hotline and puts harsher penalties on people who commit domestic violence against women. And this is just in one particular state, Punjab, or the province of Punjab. And in 1961, a body within the government of Pakistan called the Council on Islamic Ideology, it came into being, it was implemented, and they have an advisory role. And a lot of the time, the National Assembly, it follows their advice. Most recently, we put out a letter that was on child brides, and there was talk about us getting involved with Girls Not Brides, an organization there that has young women's interests, so people can have full, fulfilling lives, not having it cut short by being, 12 years old and married to someone 3 times your age and basically stuck in that condition, not getting an education, et cetera, et cetera. So in Pakistan, in the National Assembly, a particular piece of legislation called the Child Marriage Restriction Amendment came out that was going to raise the age of marriage for girls to be the same as boys, 18, and the Council on Islamic Ideology came out saying that was blasphemous and un-Islamic, and they went so far as to say that girls could be married off as early as 9 if the signs of puberty were present. And because of their recommendation, the Standing Committee on Religious Affairs, I think that's what it's called, it cut the bill. So right now, there's talk about expanding this particular bill nationwide, the one about domestic violence against women, and the Council on Islamic Ideology will have none of it. They released, most sources that I saw on this said it was 75 pages. Some of them said that it was 163 pages, but essentially they were coming out with their rules and regulations on how women should behave and the rights of women in Pakistan. And the most prominent thing that made the media was that it said that if a woman needs to be punished, she should be lightly hit with a scarf or a turban. But still, this bill, rather than pushes for the protection of women. It advocates light domestic violence, which is still domestic violence. Letters coming out on that. On top of that, there's more happening
Jason,
in
I'm so
Saudi
sorry.
Arabia.
And there's no good time to interrupt you because these are all
Yeah.
such potent topics. But I want to squeak in John Kerr for a brief update. He's joined us on the call. So as always,
Excellent.
this was wonderful and thorough, and we'll hear
Thank
more
you
from
so
you
much.
next time. Thank you.
Of course.
John, if you're there, I just want to give you a few minutes here to give us the highlights of what you've been up to and maybe put any calls out to us about what you're thinking is needed next in the community. John, are you there? And remember to *6 to unmute yourself or to click your microphone button. I can try to help you out now here. John, I've unmuted you, so can you tell us what's going on? Hello, John.
Yeah, hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'll be just a few minutes. I don't anybody else to speak, but so the two broad projects, for anyone who hasn't heard, the first one's called Reason Revival, but it's basically an effort to bring a lot of people together over every form of media possible and across different ideologies and groups and across demographics across America. For the purpose of tackling dogmatism and tribalism within American politics and finding better ways to have conversations and better ways to humanize one another as conservatives, liberals, blacks, whites, someone who lives in the countryside or lives in the inner city or lives out on the West Coast versus the Midwest. So the country's been very polarized, and people are there's a lot of ideological, dogmatic thinking within how we talk about very consequential issues. So the purpose is to converge on every form of media, from podcasts to Skype to radio shows and interviews and YouTube videos, and it's basically an arms race of moral psychology and ways to better have conversations. And so I'm going down to the Reason Rally. I'm driving down there today. I'm going to try to connect with some of the speakers there. I've already talked to a few of them. And basically really build a grassroots support for this. And in the next few months, my friends had a production meeting. So the next couple of months, it should be up and running. And it's a completely, bottom-up movement. There's no one, person in charge. It's an effort to apply the forces of reason and rationality and reasonable activism and science activism into politics. So just one quick concrete example. Justice reform and prison reform is a big issue, and a lot of our policies for that really, in terms of like mass incarceration and drug war and things like that, a lot of those don't really map onto scientific reality. They're not grounded in facts and evidence-based approaches. So if you have a bunch of skeptics and free thinkers going to, town hall meetings and hearings and things like that, and they basically get on the microphone and demand that policymakers give good reasons and fact-based answers as to why a hurtful or an irrational policy is continuing, that puts pressure on our policymakers to actually give reasons rather than to give emotion-based answers. And I think that can be extremely profound and transformative when we use science and reason to sort of build a third voice in this country between the tribalism on the left and the right, as it sometimes plays out, and to try to foster a new movement of reason-based thinking. I think reason-based thinking should be the next big wave of American sort of the next big voice in our politics. It could transcend the left-right dichotomy. You could be a liberal, you could be a conservative, but reason-based thinking should be the next movement. At least that goes the idea behind it. So the second update, and I'll be really brief here because I think most of you heard this, is about, and it touches on what this gentleman was saying, freedom rights within Islamic societies, including the revival of scientific thinking and how to best foster that on the ground in a way that's led by activists, dissidents, seculars, but also by moderate and liberal Muslims, people like Magnitsky, there's dozens of people in the public sphere, and actually thousands of them who are themselves Muslim, but they are fighting for a more a version of Islam that allows for separation of class and state, allows for a plurality of views and free speech and women's rights. And every tool we can muster up to support this, every form of social media and mass strategic communication and the support of distance can help bridge sort of this divide and actually build a bridge between Western civilization and more closed Islamic societies, where we're supporting the free thinkers and the liberal Muslims in that part of the world. So there's a lot of people working on this. What my specific project here is focused on is bringing together every sphere of expertise, from media, strategic communications, cybersecurity, social and behavioral science, cognitive science. In other words, bring these different skill sets together under the same umbrella of focus and look at how we can best foster these movements across the Islamic world. And so an example is the revival of science and skepticism within, say, Egypt or Syria or somewhere like that. You know, the best way to do that is often going to be different than it would be in this country. So directly attacking Islam through certain venues, that is often necessary if you are supporting atheists within Islam. But in some cases, if you want to foster a revival of science, it makes more sense to work work within the framework, work within the culture and work within what best resonates with people on the ground in a way that understands target audience and the best ways to disseminate the different types of media and the lines of persuasion and how to amplify existing voices that are already in the cafes and the street corners and bloggers. And so a big caveat there is cybersecurity for distant bloggers, giving them a safe space to talk about anything they want, from atheism to freedom to human rights to reforming Islam, and to do it in a way that's secure, safe, and protects jihadis from trying to leak their information or put their lives in danger. And it's not perfect, but it's good. It's a good first step, and there's people already doing that to some degree. So the next concrete step here is I'm going to send out this a document on this, basically a proposal paper on it. And I've been talking to different human rights groups like CFI, Human Rights Foundation, Movements.org, and others. And the idea is to try to get us all informally talking and to kind of get a roundtable set up or a working group and to share what we're doing in this regard, what we want to do, and share the best ideas and just find a concrete project to collaborate on. And then we can use crowdfunding and other things to really get the ball rolling on this. I call it a convergence for fostering human rights within Islamic societies led by dissidents and liberal Muslims. So anyway, if anyone has any questions on that, feel free. And anyone else who wants to talk, please jump in.
Yes, please. Anyone, if they have questions for either Jason or John, now is the time as we're wrapping up the call. All right, in that case, I'll just ask Ms. Rogers if she has any final words for us. Edwina?
Yes, I know Hugo wanted to get in. He is fresh back from Chile and Argentina and said a lot was happening there. So let's see if he made it on the phone.
I do see him here, so let's get a brief update from him. Hugo, I'm going to unmute you. Hugo, do you have an update for us?
Hello everybody. Yes, just briefly to tell you, I've been this month in Argentina and in Chile, and so I took the chance to get a little bit the sense of how the church and state relations are going on. Chile is moving forward with divorce and civil rights laws which are progressive, so it's more or less calm in that sense. And Argentina is suffering, on the other hand, the everyday more pressing presence of the Pope Francis in everyday politics. Organizing in the Vatican a meeting with judges from all over the country who are precisely considering the mismanagement and corruption of the previous government, which was very much connected with the Pope and prone to his policies. So there is more and more anger with this attitude of the Vatican, which would have been probably much better addressed to call the judges or to call the priests to cooperate with the child abuse cases and so on, which are never in the agenda of the Vatican, as far as we know. So there is much anger for all this, and there is also interest of the Church in promoting social anger against the current administration, which is struggling with a deep economic crisis. So it's not very promising what I've seen there. And I guess that soon we will have to, as SPI, try to consider some particular cases where we should demonstrate our concern for this growing intermission in national politics in South America. Same happens with Venezuela, where the Pope was about to send a mission in support of President Maduro, which was cancelled at the last minute, fortunately. But there is this attempt to be actively in support of populist and dictatorships or authoritarian. Let's not say dictatorship, but authoritarian regimes in the region by the Church. So, well, that's basically it. There is a growing presence and how to say, not disguised in any way, pressure of the Catholic Church, which was not seen for many years before now in South American policy. So this is what I wanted to share with you, and I think that we should be, how to say, we should be careful and watching closely what's going to happen there, because I think there is going to be some sort of social commotion because of economic problems and so on, and the Church is going to be an active participant in fueling that social tension. So, well, that's it. Thank you very much.
So, Hugo, it sounds like maybe we need to get you back with Jason over email and get a few new letters done, and I can take those letters and get meetings with some of the ambassadors here and maybe the State Department, see if we can at least register our complaints.
Yes, indeed. I can send you a number of clippings and what's being put on the press now, because until December with the previous government there was not much room for free press and freedom of expression. So now it's more possible to see this. The concern, this attitude is from the Church is raising in the liberal population. So yes, I will come with more precise details on all these issues to you.
Thank you. And you heard Jason's long queue of issues that we're working on, and he's researching and dropping letters on. When we get your information, we can jump the queue. Okay.
Yes, I like very much what he mentioned on Colombia. Colombia is becoming one of the most liberal states in all over South America. They have now, thanks to the Supreme Court, they have euthanasia, they have equal marriage, and they have a number of provisions which will have never passed the Congress, but they were sort of legislated by the Supreme Court, which is a very important thing, and I'm happy with that. So yes, we will work together with Jay on this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So Madeline, we'll turn it back over to you, and you can wrap us up.
Okay, well, not much more to say except that we'll be meeting again on July 7th, and thanks again to all the participants. We'll see you then.